Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a rare Sunday show, but this is just culminating the Eastern Front 2 weeks of shows we had, although there is still the show with Ian McGregor. I will schedule at some point about Stalingrad. He is insanely busy with life and work, but I will schedule that at some point in the future. But today, it's Lend-Lease. So my guest today is a historian currently living in Austria, but originally from the Czech Republic. His presentation is a version of his master's thesis. So welcome to World War II TV, Denis Havlat. So good evening, sir. How are you today?
Good evening. Good. How are you?
Very well. So we're here again. So we tried it the first time, but this time no internet gremlins, and all is looking good. So before we bring up your PowerPoint, my first question is when you were doing your thesis, because obviously World War II, there's an awful lot of subjects you can examine, and you're from the Czech Republic, you moved around Europe. Why did you feel that Lend-Lease was worth studying and having a reappraisal?
Because once I studied it, World War II, to be exact, I came across Lend-Lease, and there were just bits and pieces of information here and there. It was mostly forgotten. So that's a topic that piqued my interest. And so, yeah, I started studying it and wrote my master's thesis about it.
And thank you. And in terms of the research, because obviously there's archives in the US, there's archives in Great Britain. What about access to Soviet Russian archives? Was that something you looked into? Was there information there available?
I wanted, but unfortunately I didn't have the funds to do it for a master thesis. But I think I found all the relevant books from the US. There's most of the data concerning the US sites. The US side. Russia is a little bit more tricky because since the mid-2000s, the archives were again slowly closed, and it's now harder to get to them than in the 90s.
Well, that's another subject for another day, is the long-term problems we're going to have after however the situation in Ukraine gets resolved. Is access to Russian archives is definitely going to be difficult and possibly impossible for some years, and reappraisal of the whole Soviet war effort will take some twists and turns in the historiography. But anyway, folks, what we'll do today is we will do questions at the end, just in case we have any internet gremlins. Dennis is going to do the presentation. We'll do questions at the end, but I'm going to fire up his PowerPoint. He's going to tell me when to move on. And we're going to go through this really interesting examination. Lots of statistics and data coming your way, folks. So sit back and enjoy. And over to you, Dennis.
Yes, so let's jump into it. So Lend-Lease, it started, as you can see, the predecessor was cash and carry. That was after the war started in 1939. President Roosevelt wanted to support the Western Allies. And there were the Neutrality Acts from the 1920s and 30s. So he first had to fight them in Congress and the Senate. And I think in November 39, he pushed the cash and carry law. This enabled the French and British to buy everything they needed in gold or dollars and carry it on their own ships, hence cash and carry. And yes, the amounts ordered were enormous. It was billions and billions of dollars of aircraft, tanks, motor vehicles, everything. And once the French fell in the summer of 1940, the British took over their orders as well. So it was an absolutely astronomical number. And this was bankrupting the country. By early 1941, the British had a few million, with M, a few $1 million left and a few 100 kilograms of gold. That was all they had left. And if Lend-Lease, if there had been no Lend-Lease, then they probably would have run out of funds by the summer of 1941. They were simply unable to pay for this. So President Roosevelt pushed the Lend-Lease Act, which started in March 1941 for the British. Eventually, over time, over the next year or two, it was extended to several dozen countries. And despite its significance, as I mentioned already, it's rarely talked about. I think I know about 2 books that deal exclusively just with the British deliveries, with the American deliveries to the British, and perhaps 5 articles. For the Soviets, it's a little better, but I think there's 10 books and 20 articles, most in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies. And that was one reason why I also wanted to examine it.
And the other thing, I guess, is it's not a very sexy subject. I mean, anybody who's a fan of World War II TV, they love logistics because we've been hammering it home to them over the last 2.5 years how important supplies and data is, and we've done some really incredible presentations about manpower and industrial might and things like that, Adam Tooze, people like that. So it should be a sexy subject, but it gets lost in the whose favorite tank it is and which command I think is great. Anyway, I'm interrupting. There we are. There's your data again. Handing it back to you.
Yeah, actually, I had the same mindset, but over time I learned that war economy and war production is more important than the battles. But let's get back to the topic. We have the top 5 recipients of Lend-Lease. Left, we have the value in 1942-43, and on the right, we have the value today. Although I have to say these are the official inflation numbers. I don't believe these are exactly right. They're multiplied with 17. So that's why the Soviet Union, for example, it says 11 billion and today 190 billion. But I think the real inflation numbers are higher than that, probably times 25, times 30. So the British would be somewhere at 700 to 800 billion, and the Soviets somewhere around 250 to 300 billion. But that's just my assessment. Economists of the Federal Reserve would perhaps say something different, but we can say it's almost certainly more than we see here. And yeah, the British received the most. The total value was 50 billion. The British got 30, the Soviets 11, French, China, and the Netherlands. And then there's like 30 other countries that got 100 million or $50 million. Yeah, and the next, please. Yeah, and just here to show the impact of Lend-Lease, because practically no one knows about this. As I said, a few books are out there. General histories of World War II almost don't mention it. This is Great Britain, but let's say for the Soviet Union, if you know Richard Overy's Russia's War from the 90s, that has, depending on the version you have, around 330 written pages, and just 4 are about Lend-Lease. And with the British is similar. You have histories that go 500 pages and perhaps 5 or 10 pages mention Lend-Lease. And here we see, for example, the impact for Great Britain. It says domestic tank production, but in this presentation, when I say tank, I mean all armored fighting vehicles. So SPGs, assault guns, tanks is under the umbrella term tank. And we can see here the British produced 27,500 tanks during World War II, and Lend-Lease delivered 30,000. So it's basically every second tank the British used in the war came from the Americans for free. Lend-Lease was free. And for aircraft is 130,000, the domestic production. Lend-Lease deliveries are again 33,000. So one in 6 aircraft the British used came from the Americans. And the last point, we have 10% of the British population were supplied with Lend-Lease food. So basically the entire British army was living from American food. Wow. And these are, I could have given here 10, 20 pages, fuel, minerals, resources, everything. This is just to show that for Great Britain was absolutely crucial. And for the Soviets, it's a different matter. We can, the next slide, please. Yeah, for the Soviets, it's something different. It's difficult to estimate the impact, what it had. But here we can see the routes from the Americans. Most of it came through the Pacific to Vladivostok. Then, of course, the Persian Gulf, and in the north through Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. And we can hear the numbers. This is millions of tons. So we have here 8 million tons, 4 million tons, 4 million tons. It was just gigantic. And yeah, the next, please. Yeah, here we can see just a small fraction of what was sent. Just a note, the aircraft and tanks are combined British and American deliveries, because the British conducted their own Lend-Lease operation between 1941 and 45, but it was around 1/10 of the American number. And yeah, I could have written 10 such pages. If I had split it up in subcategories, probably 100. You see, wow. Aircraft, tanks, anti-aircraft guns, telephone cables, explosives, the famous trucks and jeeps, army boots, food. Yeah, it was just incredible what the Americans delivered to the Russians. And 18 million tons in total. The value around $11 billion. So probably today $190 billion. Probably over 200 million, because the inflation numbers are probably not that correct.
And I know we said we'd do questions at the end, but this is my question rather than the viewers. We know that in 41, 42, even into 43, the US, the UK, they're struggling in some regards to fulfill their own military requirements. I mean, there's a shortage of certainly trained personnel and things like that. So how was the US going about the management of this politically? Because you've got all these various people in the Senate and Congress, and people are looking at budgets and going, you're shipping this amount of stuff to other people. How were they managing to balance the books and keep everybody happy with all this?
Well, the first thing is, it could be used right away to fight the Germans. As you said, the British and Americans were building up their forces. These are in America, these are in Great Britain. It takes time to ship them to North Africa or somewhere around the globe. And with this, the Soviets get it. And depending where it comes, if Vladivostok or Murmansk, it can be on the front in a few days or a few weeks. So this was the first factor. And the second factor was, every Russian that was killing a German made things easier for the British and Americans. That was just a fact. That was real politics. So everything the Americans and British gave to the Russians, they saved themselves in effort.
That makes sense. Moving on.
Yes, please. Yes, and after we had this big slide of numbers, here's the percentage of some items compared to the total Soviet domestic production. And we have, as we can see, tanks and aircraft, 13-17%. Motor vehicles, absolutely important. Locomotives, 20 times as much as the Soviets produced during the war. Metals, explosives. I could have written about fuel. A large percentage of the fuel came from the Americans and British, and so on. And it's quite strange, because people tend to belittle these numbers. Exactly, 13% of tanks and 17 aircraft. Percent of aircraft. It was like, every 10th tank came from the Americans or British, or 1 in 8 aircraft. That wasn't all that important. To these people, I can say, imagine your wage gets cut by 13%.
Yeah.
Imagine the last 4 years, you would have gotten 13% less monthly wage. Most people would be hurt by it, and for some people it would be catastrophic. So just because it's a small number doesn't mean that it isn't important.
Definitely, and David O'Keefe, who's Professor O'Keefe, regular guest, is messaging us from Canada, and he's talked about it on previous shows. The tanks and the aircraft and the motor vehicles are very much the obvious thing that we can see in the posters. We see that war aid of a column of Studepakers driving down a snowy road in the Soviet Union. That makes sense. But the industrial support, the tooling, the industrial diamonds, things like that, aluminium materials, that was a key part of it, because the Soviet Union, we've talked about it on previous shows, went from a almost agricultural society to an industrial society. Or part of that process was during World War II. In order to make their own stuff, they had to have the machining. So how important, in your opinion, was just getting them the ability to improve their industry?
That's difficult to say. After the war, the Soviets claimed that between 1941 and 43, Lend-Lease accounted for perhaps 4% of their production. But as we can see, aluminium is around 45% of the Soviet production. That means 1/3 of all aluminium they used in the war came from the US.
Wow.
It is in aircraft, for example, they used wooden components before these aluminium deliveries. It's difficult. It's quite possible that they would have used worse materials, which would have shortened the lifespan of the equipment. But we can say it was important. How important? This is probably impossible to tell, but we can tell it was definitely important.
Well, this is going to be something we're going to talk about at the end of the show, is the interpretation of the benefits of Lend-Lease is open to what historians want to say. And, when we think of some of the great, like you said, Richard Overy there, and David Glantz and David Stahl and other people who've written about the Eastern Front, how you interpret its assistance to the Soviet Union is based on your opinion as a historian. But you can't argue with the data there. You can't argue with the actual figures. And the locomotives, we've talked about it a lot on the channel, about the importance of railway lines in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Front and the hubs. That alone, just the figure in locomotives is amazing. Without the ability to shift their tanks from the factories to the fronts, that they would have been unable to wage war. So incredible statistics. Should we move on to the next slide?
Yes, we can. Yeah, and this is to address the following topic. Most of Lend-Lease came after Kursk. So in 1941, 42, 43, up to the summer of 43, to the Battle of Kursk, 1/3 of all deliveries that came during the war reached the Soviet Union, and 2/3 after the mid of 1943. Yeah, it's not so much a discussion if it was important or not. If one looks at these casualty numbers, basically the Soviets needed everything they could get their hands on. We have, these are compiled from German and Soviet statistics. Of course, even in World War II, even in this conflict, we have 2 or 3 numbers for everything. So they are not perhaps entirely correct. But if one looks at them, it doesn't really matter if you give or take 1,000. It doesn't change the big picture. Basically, the Germans had a kill ratio of 4-1 in tanks, 4-1 in aircraft, and around 6-1 in men. And it was even, I just don't know how the Soviets could have either prevailed, survived, or done as well without all these deliveries. So they just needed them, especially for 1944-45, to build up their numerical superiority. And without these thousands of items received, they would have definitely done much worse. The question is, how much worse?
Yeah.
And I think we can go to the next. Yeah, this is already the conclusion part. We can say definitely that for Great Britain, Lend-Lease was crucial, most likely life-saving, but definitely crucial, as we have seen at the beginning of the presentation. Every second tank was an American tank. Trucks, the British received hundreds of thousands of US trucks as jeeps, same as the Soviets. So something like, I think every second truck the British used came from the Americans as well. And the resources, Britain received aluminium as well, iron, steel, nickel, zinc, all of these materials that are necessary for war production. And yeah, it's difficult. We would need to see a parallel reality if there exists, but we can say that without Lend-Lease, Britain would sometime, it's my personal estimate from the data I know, around 1943, 44, it would have to quit the war because it wouldn't have been any longer possible for them to wage war. For the Soviet Union, it's a little more difficult, but the impact in 1941, we can say, was minimal. There were a few hundred tanks and aircraft helping in the Battle of Moscow from November of 1941. But if they were absent, then it would have changed some regional fronts or some advances. But Lend-Lease didn't save the Soviet Union in 1941. That's even, I think Alexander Hill had an article in the Journal of Slavic Military Study, and he says the same. It was certainly helpful at some segments of the front, but it didn't change the big picture. For 1942, it's again difficult, but we can definitely say that it was far more important. Perhaps it was, perhaps without Lend-Lease, the supplies, the Germans could have conducted a successful Case Blue and conquered the Caucasus, which again would have led to a possible Russian defeat in 1943. But it's difficult to say. We know, for example, the Stalingrad front. I know of a German report that claims, I think it was the 19th of October, and it claims today we destroyed 100 tanks, and of these, the majority were of British and American origin. So we know these deliveries were used. They were certainly helpful. If these tanks had not been there, perhaps the Germans would have conquered this district, which a few days later would have resulted in this district falling and so on. But we can it's difficult to say, but it was important. If it was the decisive factor between their victory or not, we cannot say. What we can say is that Lend-Lease was absolutely crucial for victory in 43 to 45. Without the trucks, jeeps, tanks, without the fuel, without everything, the Russians could never have advanced as fast as they did. I probably a year. I think they would have been thrown at least a year back. So they would have stood in May 1945. They would not have stood in Berlin, but somewhere in Belarus for twice the casualties. And it's important to note that historically in 1946, that was just a year after the cancellation of Lend-Lease, they experienced a famine that killed 1 million or 2 million Soviet citizens. So without these Lend-Lease food deliveries, they probably would have had this famine in 1945 and could not have continued the war. I know there is a quote from David Glantz. I think it's from his book When Titans Clashed. He made the claim, I think it goes something like this: left to its own devices, the Red Army would have still prevailed, but it would have taken 12 to 18 months longer. And yeah, this was based on research made in the 90s. And I think it's outdated because the Russians could not have waged the war for another 12 or 18 months without Lend-Lease. And if they could have waged it at all after 1945, because their casualties would have been catastrophic. And the result was, yes, it was basically the Soviets, they won the war. They just didn't want to admit or to say why they won the war. Because why? First, it legitimized Stalin's rule. Stalin won, so he's the guy, he's our leader without fail, without flaw. The second is legitimized communism, because, look, we defeated the Germans on our own, so communism has to be superior to fascism, and our economy has to be superior to the German economy. And if they say that they basically won the war without American and British help, which they can only say when they claim that Lend-Lease was not important, it would also mean that the Soviet system was superior to democracy and market economy. So this was a myth that was propagated after the war to among other things. Another reason was to make the Soviet Union appear stronger than it was. And yes, this victory over Germany made the USSR appear much stronger than it was. In hindsight, with all the data we know, conventionally, the Russians or the Eastern Bloc probably wasn't a threat to the Western powers. I recall in the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, he writes that it was embarrassing. It was 1954 or 55, and there was a parade in Moscow, and most of the trucks and jeeps used in this parade were still the Lend-Lease trucks received in 1943, 44, 45. So he just said, 10 years after the war, we still were not able to motorize our army, and we were forced to use American equipment, which was just embarrassing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think this myth of Soviet or Russian strength was also a factor in the invasion of Ukraine, because until February 2022, the Russian army was the second or third best army in the world, or at least everyone claimed that. And yeah, we saw that they overestimated themselves.
No, definitely that, and that's, you know, the connection with modern events is interesting, and a potential rabbit hole to go down. But I think there's lots of comments, lots of questions. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And I think one of the things that also comes up when there's been conversations about the vehicles and trucks and things like that is the British Army, for example, in 1939-40, the number of different manufacturers of truck that were making vehicles for British Army: Crossley, Albion, Morris, Bedford, Vauxhall, Guy, Humber. It goes on and on and on. And with each of those manufacturers, there were model types of 4 or 5 different models, all of which had different head gaskets and engines and fuel pumps and water pumps and wheel nuts and everything like that. It's not just the number of vehicles that Britain and the Soviets were getting from the America. It was the streamlined efficiency of them, in that it was mostly Studebachers that went to Russia from America, as far as I understand, UGMCs. Well, that, if you've got one type of vehicle, it's one type of spare part, one type of stores provision, one type of head gasket to issue. The jeeps that went out to the Far East, I mean, everything the British took out to India and Burma had to come from somewhere else in the empire. And if you've got 30 different manufacturers of truck going out there, again, 30 different types of maintenance. If you've got lots of Jeeps and Dodges or whatever it would be, you're making everything inefficient. And the same would apply because food's going to come up. if the food had to get from the US to the Soviet Union by that, I'll go back to the map there. It means that food is in tins. It's able to be, or it's dehydrated, or it's in a packing, means it can be transported. So that's exactly what the Soviet army wants. It wants food that won't go off, that won't deteriorate, that they can put on trains. It can get cold, it can get hot, and when you open the tin, it's still in good condition. So I think the improvement of the efficiency of the armies supplied by Lend-Lease is just as important as the actual number of things going through. It's the fact they're better, not better, but more consistent. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, of course. It was. Yeah, again, this is something that is extremely difficult to say because while millions of tons were sent, it was just around 2% of the Soviets' own food production. But it certainly was more durable and of better quality. So this is something that's impossible to tell. No? We know it had an impact, but how much? Yeah, impossible.
Right. Well, we'll do with some questions. So one of the things we've got a reviewer. I've got to go back and find it. Alexei was talking about explosives. I'll go back to your slide because you did say that you could expand any of these into more information, but because you have the figure there of where's the one about explosives? Is it the next one? Yeah, there we are. 15%. So I'm going to go back and find Alexei's comment there because it was really interesting. So bear with me, folks. I've got a slide back up there. Here we are. He's working with Russian archival sources. The most necessary things were explosives, TNT, and I don't know how to pronounce Tulien for it, and powder. About 50% of TNT received in the US. So with the explosives, because there's not just one type of explosive. There's all sorts of amatol and charges and powders and that. How did that work? In that are the Americans giving the Russians the things they've got spare, or are they trying to tune it to what the Soviets need for certain weapon systems and certain artillery pieces? Because there's a whole mismatch of what you can do with explosive materials and the various ingredients. Does that make sense the way I worded that question?
Yes, but it depended on a time period. In 41, right. 42, of course, they were sending everything they could. So there was a little of chaos. There were several types of explosives. From 1943 onwards, when American production kicked in, it was more orderly. But yeah, the types were TNT, shells. The American British delivered millions of shells. These were already filled with explosives ready to go. So yeah, it's again difficult. We know it's important, but how important is difficult to say.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Sheldrake was asking about the word Lend-Lease. I mean, it's not really a very apt and appropriate description, because lend implies you're giving it, but you're going to get it back, or if you're not going to get it back, you'll at least get paid for it. So in terms of all this, it was pretty much one way, the traffic. Explain how that process went of repayment or addressing the fact they've been lent these goods.
Well, that was something President Roosevelt came up with to convince the American public to go along. I think everyone or most people know the famous, if the house of my neighbor is on fire, I'm going to borrow him the Lend-Lease, the hoosh. I don't want the money for the hoosh. I want it back after the fire is out. And so he said he's going to lend it to them or lease it to them, and they're going to pay it back. Actually, some of the equipment was returned, not much, but some. After the war, the British and Russians paid for some of it, I think around 1/4 or 1/3, depending on the source. And they gave some resources for free to the Americans as a form of repayment.
Okay. So we'll just plow through some of the questions now. So Mad Cat is asking, did the US have any problems with the Japanese over Lend-Lease to the USSR through Vladivostok? Did any nations ship anything back to the US? Well, you just partly answered that second question, but the problems with the Japanese?
Not as long as the ships were sailing under the Russian flag. That's, I think, if you go one slide up, if you would be so kind. Yes, we have, after the explosives, 90 ships. And these were merchant vessels that were given to the Russians. They planted the Russian flag on it, and because the Japanese had a treaty with Russia, they were neutral. They let them through at Vladivostok.
Okay, thank you. And Alexei is adding that by 1945, 30% of Red Army trucks from the Western Allies. But of course, as you're making the point, the results change as the war goes on because there are losses. So trucks that are sent in 1943, some are going to get blown up, some are going to get hit by artillery strikes or break down. So by 40, as the war changes, the number of vehicles and armaments from outside of the Red Army is constantly going to be in flux. It's going to be going up and down depending on, because the life expectancy of a Jeep in World War II was 2 weeks or something, wasn't it? Whether it's being used by Americans or British or Russians, they weren't supposed to be long lasting. So by 1945, obviously Lend-Lease, when does Lend-Lease start declining in terms of, it was building up in 41, 42. When does it hit its peak and when does it start declining?
Its peak, 4 months. I think it reaches its actual peak in late 1944.
Right.
It's of course after the defeat of Germany, it goes down, but the peak is something late 1944, and then it remains a few months on this level. Something one third of all Lend-Lease deliveries came in 1944, and then after 1945, it starts shrinking.
Okay, thank you. Thomas Chase, and this is a subject, we're going to be doing a show about this in the future, about the moving of the factories away from the front line to Siberia and places like that. So Thomas is asking, and this goes with the question of industrializing and helping them with the tooling. Did the US and UK help Russia with industrialization of Siberia as part of the Lend-Lease program? So that could also mean advice as well as materials.
This is a topic that is a little obscure. I know in the 1920s there were Americans and British at the Urals building up Soviet factories, supplying them with know-how. In 41, 42, there were some Americans helping the Russians, but the Russians were extremely distrustful and didn't let many people in. So I would say yes, but it weren't many people.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to go back. Forgive me, folks. There's so many questions. You may have to, if you want them answered. I'll put them in, type them again because I can't scroll back and go through them. But while we're waiting for some questions to come in, the question for you, as you've studied this, is that the historiography of the understanding of Lend-Lease, as you said, there are people like David Glantz, who hopefully, folks, will be on World War II TV on Friday. I finally got that panel discussion kind of sorted and squared away. Should be happening Friday. Dismisses to some extent how important Lend-Lease was. Is there more information to understand about it? Certainly, there's more ways of interpreting the data, but do you think there'll be more swings in terms of how we assess the importance of Lend-Lease?
It's a difficult question. We have the numbers, or most of the numbers, and it depends on the historian.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm just waiting for some more questions to come in there. And I know David O'Keefe wanted to address the issue of food again, because that is another important. Again, the posters about the images we have about propaganda or about Lend-Lease are always of the aircraft and the tanks and the guns, because it's the most obvious thing that the public can relate to. They can relate to a tank or an aircraft being held over. But food, another aspect is the technology. I mentioned it earlier about the sheer distances they have to ship this stuff there. Did that result in the US having to devise systems of how to get food that far? I mean, I know they're doing the same thing for their Navy in the Pacific and what have you anyway, but were there some sort of technological advances made to get food that distance?
Well, of course, food was delivered over the oceans before the war, but the Americans had to rationalize it and make it more efficient to fill up the ship as much as possible. So there were some advances in compressing the food or depriving it of the water. Therefore, it shrunk down and they could transport more. So yes, there were definitely improvements and rationalizations.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question there about can you ask him about the Albert Weeks book, Russia's Life Save? Have you read that one?
Yes, and unfortunately, I have to say I'm not fond of it.
Okay, explain more.
I think it has 180 pages, and he starts in the 18th century explaining Russian and American relations. And it isn't until page 120 or so that he arrives in 1941. So basically, 2/3 of the book deal with a time period hundreds of years or dozens of years before World War II.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question about the losses, because when we talk about the Battle of the Atlantic, which I know we're not talking about that, but I'm going to bring it up as an example. You're talking about getting ships from across the Atlantic from the USA or Canada to Great Britain. If you lose a certain number of ships in the convoys, which we did, the time needed to kind of replace those ships and make sure there's another ship with the same, let's say it's bicycle tires, you can sort out the next ship with another replacement batch of bicycle tires quite quickly. But with the distances everything is going to the Soviet Union, obviously there were losses. There were ships that were lost on convoys. We know about the Arctic convoys to Murmansk. How adaptable was the system? If you've got 10 ships in a convoy and 9 carry the tanks, I'm just using this as an example, and 1 carries the spare parts, but you lose the one with the spare parts, that means the 9 with the tanks are then less able to perform their function. How much effort was there to make sure that there's like a bit of everything in every ship, or how did they cope with the fact that of losses and losing vital things, I think is the question.
Yes, as you mentioned, losses were expected, and that's why they mixed as much in the ships they could. So each ship, or nearly all ships, there wasn't an exclusive ships. This ship is just for tanks. This ship is just for spare parts. Every ship had something. And this was a problem in 1942, but from 1943 onwards, almost no ships were lost.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting point here from Caractacus about Soviet production figures. He said, is there a good chance that Soviet production figures are wildly exaggerated because factory owners could be shot if they fail to reach targets, so they always claim big numbers? So when you're looking at let's say 40% of the vehicles were US because the Russians produced 60%, how accurate can we know those Russian figures are?
I have to say, from my personal experience, I would be quite wary, because when conducting research on the aircraft, for example, if you compared the Soviet domestic production with the aircraft they had on hand in 1945, and then with the Lend-Lease deliveries, then they had something like 15,000 aircraft fewer than they should have had. And with tanks, it's something similar. I think in 1941, it's not a big number, but they were missing in Soviet statistics 200 to 300 tanks which were unexplained, if they were lost, what happened to them. And so personally, I would say, yes, there's definitely a possibility that production statistics and even casualty statistics, some of them are wrong.
Okay, thank you. And as a follow-up to your remark about the book, he is saying, I've got to find the question again. He said, thank you, that's great. He agrees with you, but more important is whether Week's book is a good source for the numbers and the data. You said it takes a long time to get to the World War II aspect, but how accurate do you think his grasp of the figures is?
From what I can recall, his numbers are basically the same. From the official archives, from the official documents about Lend-Lease. So I would say the last third of his book, was written in 2004, so I can't say about Russian casualties or Russian figures, but the stuff, what the US delivered to the Soviets, that's taken from the direct documents, so that's solid.
Okay, so another question for me. You said about the early way of advertising Lend-Lease was to immediately give the Soviets the ability to wage war while the British and Americans and the Allies are gaining time and getting training. But as the war moves on and the inevitable result of the war becomes clearer, are there things that the Soviets requested that we didn't send because we said, no, we don't want them having that? Because we want them to industrialize themselves to be able to wage war against the Germans, but we don't want them to industrialize themselves and kind of take on our technology and become too powerful. So is there anything sort of 43, 44 where we're going, yeah, we're not going to send that stuff to them because it'll help them too much? Is that something you found?
Yes, of course. For example, the most modern weapons, the Americans refused that outright. The British, I think the Russians received Spitfires, but only like 200 pieces. So most were the older aircraft. And yes, once the momentum shifted, and from 1944, the Soviets asked more for resources and tools to build up their industry after the war. The Americans and British, to a lesser extent, definitely said, "Yeah, we're not delivering that."
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to go back to some comments there. So David O'Keefe is just making a comment. Traditionally, tanks and aircraft have been seen as a band-aid solution, very similar to government subsidies during the pandemic. It'll get you through, but it's not a long-term solution. So that kind of backing up what you're saying now is that everything that, or not everything, but a lot of what was being given was short-term. It's to help them immediately, but not necessarily in the long term there. We're getting some more questions about where is it now? From Pat, were production figures falsely boosted, as in Germany, with numbers boosted by repaired stuff being listed as new production? So it's another question about the Soviet data. So and something being listed as new, but in fact isn't new. It's an already produced one that's being repaired. Is that something you think is a factor?
I haven't come across this. No, so it would be possible, but I can't tell. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. And I think there is at the moment in terms of questions. Another thing I'm just going to ask you to keep it going, when folks fire away with more questions, is that when did you write your thesis? Was it a few years ago now?
2015, I think. Yes, a few years
ago. So we're now talking 8 years ago, just about. So we're in another era of information and sharing of information. If you go back to study this subject again in a few years' time, do you think some of your findings will be different? Do you think you'll come to any different conclusions, or are you pretty steady about your assessment of it?
Well, it's quite possible that it changes a little, but from what I know, there hasn't been much further research about this topic from the 2000s, early 2000s onwards, except a few articles in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies. And I would say it's important. If I would study it again and find new data, it would just change the degree of the importance, but not the verdict that it's important.
So I've put that slide up again of that, with the actual breakdown in percentages there, because as we said earlier, 13% tanks doesn't sound very much, but as you said there, if you lose your wage goes down, your salary goes down by 13%. That's a big difference. The locomotives factor there, I think, is enormous. If you were to break down any of those items to a, you said you could do another page on that. Of those ones listed there, is there an area you think is particularly important that's overlooked? Steel or food, or you mentioned aluminium and explosives. Is there something there that you think really, really is the key, most vital thing?
That's difficult as well. It depends on the time period. In 1942, for example, the Soviets needed every tank and every plane, every military equipment they could get. In 43, 44, the resources were more important. So it depends on the time period. But I would say, yes, the tanks in 42 and aircraft were probably among the most important things because they helped to stop the Germans and turn the tide.
No, thank you. And the other thing I'm going to bring up is, we talked about this streamlining and making more efficient the technology, because the discussion about tank design and T-34, 75s and 85s come up in the sidebar there, because again, the ability, giving the Soviets the ability to retool and industrial diamonds and calibration devices in factories also meant that they could perhaps push their technology a little bit more because they have this support. And you said it yourself in that, that the aircraft went from perhaps wooden designs to aluminium designs. So I think even the design of the later war tanks, the later war Soviet built tanks and aircraft, would it be fair to say that they were influenced by the fact they're getting this material support from the US and indeed the UK to give them a boost in terms of technology? So the designs, their own designs, were better because of the aid they were getting. Does that make sense?
Yes, in that case, I think I would have to say no, because, for example, the Soviets were not fond of most Western tanks, although they needed them, especially in 41 when they were producing thousands of light tanks. But they relied on Lend-Lease. They relied on their own production, and what they didn't want to produce because it was too expensive, or what they couldn't produce, they let the Americans and British deliver. So it's possible that something that was delivered which they couldn't or didn't want to produce was then taken over or examined. But I don't think that their own designs in tanks or aircraft were much impacted by Lend-Lease.
Okay, so we've got another question from Trent Telenko about explosives again. So Trent is asking, what percentage of total explosives and artillery propellant were Lend-Lease chemicals in the 41 to 43 period? Because we did an earlier World War II program with Sasha about the Red God of War, about Russian artillery, and he said 55% in that period. So, as you said there, the figures you put up are the total. So, does explosives have a peak earlier in the war?
No, frankly, I think this number is exaggerated. 55% sounds way too much. Perhaps 25% I could possibly imagine, but 55, in my opinion, is definitely too much.
Okay, but then we love the fact that historians don't agree. We don't agree on anything. That is important. So, well, if there's anything else you want to say there about that you haven't said in the presentation way, that we can do that. I think the comments now are more comments rather than questions, but I'll just check if there's anything else to ask you there. If not, here we are. Scott Grimwood is asking, can Denis talk about the equipment given to the USSR specifically to be used against the Japanese in 1945? Now, there's an interesting topic. That's another element of the potential way, the changing face of warfare. Is that an aspect?
A very small one, because they had they had 4 months. 4 months between the defeat of Germany and the surrender of Japan. So it wasn't really that much time. The Americans could switch these deliveries, but they delivered some naval equipment, landing craft for the possible invasion of Japan, which then didn't took place.
Okay, thank you. So we got talking about Sherman tanks, because it came up, and about whether or not the Red Army tankers liked Sherman tanks or not. Because I've heard this before. Some people say the Russian tank crews thought they were brilliant and wanted more, and other people said they didn't like them. They preferred the Soviet produced tanks. Isn't this again connected with, to some extent, with Soviet propaganda? Because the Soviets aren't going to tell their people that the stuff they're getting from the West is better than their stuff, because that goes against the idea. So as studying it from a neutral point of view, what would be your assessment overall of, for example, the Sherman tank? It was, as we all know, it was an okay tank. It was pretty good. It wasn't perfect, but the Sherman tank, as in your perception, did the Russians like it or not like it?
Well, the Russians, from the British and Americans, they received around 10 or 15 models, and they didn't like most. They liked, I think, the Valentine. They explicitly wanted the Canadians to keep producing Valentines because they liked that one. And they liked the Sherman with the 76 millimeter gun, but this one didn't arrive until 1943. But they didn't like the Grant, for example. They weren't fond of the Churchill, for example. So yeah, some they liked, but most they didn't.
And the other thing that connects with that, of course, is that the suitability of a tank in one country with its terrain and its climate doesn't necessarily mean it will then be suitable in another country's terrain and climate. We know that with moving things like Spitfires and Hurricanes around the world, is where they worked well in one environment, sometimes they didn't work elsewhere because of filters, because of this, that, and the other. So it would be hard for the British or the Americans to predict exactly in what terrain some of these equipment is going to be used, because it would not be the terrain in which it was designed for or trained in. Which is worth mentioning. So a great question from Lorelei, which I'm going to go back and find now, which is, which we knew we were going to get, which is which countries paid off their lease balances?
Well, most paid it off apart. The British paid off theirs, I think, in the 1950s. The Soviets needed until the 1960s, and there was some special contract with grain that the Soviets delivered 1 million tons of grain for free, and with that it was settled. The smaller countries paid back some of it, but of course the Americans were only interested in the 2 or 3 big players.
Okay, thank you. And Gary Giamara from the USA is making a comment rather than a question. It's interesting because a lot of the viewers today are in Britain or they're Northern Ireland. They're English speaking, and it's interesting that the sidebar conversation is much more about the benefit to the Soviets of Lend-Lease, but not about the British. And as we got the data up there, the British got a huge amount of Lend-Lease. And I wonder whether, and I'll be interested to the British people watching this, whether if we admit as Britons that we got a lot of stuff from the US, it's somehow damaging our Britain standing alone, the Churchill spirit, that we did it all on our own, we didn't need the help. So we can be much more analytical about the Soviet assistance from Lend-Lease, but we don't really want to admit how much we got ourselves. I mean, Pat I've known for a lot of years, Pat is saying, not that many American trucks went to the British military, but he's thinking, I think, too much of the European theatre of operations. A lot of the Dodges and Jeeps that the Americans supplied the British went to the Far East. They went to India. They went to Burma. If you look at some of the RAF squadrons and they were flying, whatever it would be, they're flying out in airfields, their Spitfires, Hurricanes, whatever, is the vehicles are Dodges, the vehicles are Jeeps and GMCs. So as a neutral, you're Czech living in Austria. Do you think us British are not really, we don't admit enough that Lend-Lease saved our asses?
Well, I said before, it's basically an unknown topic, and I imagine the British to some degree do the same things the Soviets did, just sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's just, it doesn't go with the, I mean, I hate that idea of Britain standing alone and all we had was ourselves and our plucky. Britain was incredibly well prepared in some ways for World War II. Our air defense system was brilliant. Our radar was improving. We had a strategy. We talked about the stay behinds, the Section 7 commando or resistance units. We were very prepared in many ways in World War II. In other ways, we weren't very prepared. So admitting that we got a lot of assistance is perhaps not very. It's not the thing we like to admit to ourselves. But I think that is probably it in terms of questions there. I think there's nothing else coming in. Trent Telengo is making a point. One of the strategic goals of US Lend-Lease was promoting economic specialization so each ally could max out military production. Does your speaker, so that's you, Denis, see evidence this strategy succeeded? Good question.
Yes, of course. The British, for example, the British reached the peak of their tank production in 1942. After that, it declined because the British knew they were getting thousands of American tanks. So they just decreased it and invested all of these workers that got free all this factory space into building aircraft or artillery shells or other stuff. For the Soviets, it's, again, more difficult to say. But yes, they benefited from this as well because they didn't have, for example, to produce that many trucks. They could concentrate on tank production. There were, I think I read in several books, they had gigantic truck plants in the Urals from the 1930s, gigantic. And because they knew they were getting tens of thousands of trucks, they just said, okay, we're going to produce tanks here instead. So I would say, yes, it definitely worked.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's one little thing to expand on the idea of Lend-Lease ships. I'll put your slide up again that had the ship. It was that one there, isn't it? It's 90 ships. So because the other thing that we haven't talked about is not just the army. It's that we talked about the air power, but the Soviet Navy. So is there anything you want to elaborate about the shipping that was sent back to Russia?
Well, as said before, most were transport ships, so that the Russians could transport it over the Pacific with under their own flag. There were some minesweepers, I recall, and landing craft. Yeah, but mostly, except for the merchant vessels, it was smaller ships, landing craft, torpedo boats, and minesweepers.
I mean, thank you for that. One of the things that came up, I forget who it came up with, is that to the best of my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we never gave the Russians Bailey bridges. And when they were pushing the Germans back, towards Germany, if the Soviets had the ability to put, I mean, they did have their own bridging capability, as the Germans did. It's just the Bailey Bridge was really, really good. And anybody who doesn't think the Bailey Bridge was good, get off my channel right away. It's one of the winning events at things in World War II. But if we'd given the Russians something like Bailey Bridge, it might have sped up their advance and pushing the Germans back. Is that something, Bailey bridging, that you've ever looked at, Dennis?
I'm familiar with it, but I would say it would depend on the number.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to have given them a lot of it. I mean, I think the British built something like 500 Bailey bridges in 3 months in Italy in 1944. I mean, it's insanely a lot. But well, I think we'll leave it at that. People are just saying that you're very articulate. You've given some great information there. If people want to go away and learn more about Lend-Lease, obviously, they can find your paper online, can't they? Your original thesis is online. Is there anything else, a good resource you would suggest for people to go and look at some data about Lend-Lease?
Well, if they want, I think I've forgotten the author. That was one of the first books about Lend-Lease. It's called The Roads to Russia. It's from 1969, and it's one of the first books written about the topic. And in the appendix, it has all the data and an entire list of 50 pages, exactly what was delivered to the Russians. So if people want the complete statistics, they can look into that. For the British, I unfortunately don't have any statistics, because in the few books I know, there's just given the dollar value, but it's extremely difficult to get the numbers of what was sent, except for the tanks and aircraft. That number is known, but the rest I would have to find for myself.
Okay, so the author of that book is Robert Hume-Jones. I just did a Google search while I was talking there. So, well, I think we'll leave it at that. And it's been delightful talking to you. I'm glad we got the show organized in the end, and the internet connection was fantastic. We got all the questions done. I look forward to extending an invitation to come back in the future, because you're very much got your historical career ahead of you. There's more work ahead of you. If you come back with another subject or another bit of analysis, we will happily have you back, because your grasp of the data is really fantastic. So, folks, nothing tomorrow on Monday, and then on Tuesday we start our Pacific War little series of shows. So I will keep an eye on YouTube, because there are some odd start times to the shows, because people joining from different parts of the world. But right now, I'm going to thank everybody for watching, and thank my guest for answering those questions and for giving us a great presentation. I will see you all next time. This is Paul Willett for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everybody.